Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to the first episode of iJihad. In this show, we will be examining a set of videos by a relatively popular Dutch YouTuber by the name of Gryffix. She is known for her content regarding the supposed dangers of Islamic fundamentalism, and how it supports, justifies, and in many cases, directly leads to the violent imposition of Islamic values onto others, otherwise known as radicalization. Her views are also supported by a popular German YouTuber by the name of KrautNT, who has even sponsored some of her videos on his own channel. As such, it would be fair to consider this rebuttal as killing two birds with one stone. So the first video we will be looking at is called Islam When the Facts Are Against You. Now, given that Gryffix doesn't present her arguments in any systematic fashion, for the sake of brevity, we won't be playing the entirety of her videos. Rather, we will only be showing those parts which present her primary points, and then respond accordingly. So let's jump right in.
What you see here is an article on the Dutch news outlet called nu.nl. It is about a recent meeting between politicians and experts regarding the topic of radicalization and jihadism. During this meeting, a few interesting facts were discussed, which inspired this article to be written and inspired me to do a video about it. Now, one of the people mentioned in this piece is Professor Paul Scheffer. Paul Scheffer is a 61-year-old political scientist and Labour Party member who wrote books like The Multicultural Drama, which you might or might not have read. You by now might understand why Professor Scheffer was invited to speak here. He knows a lot about topics like integration, and it won't surprise you that he brought some rather interesting facts to the table. And by rather interesting, I mean deeply disturbing. As it turns out, 50% of Dutch Muslims believe that democracy and Islam are incompatible. That's right, I'll repeat that again. 50% of Dutch Muslims believe that democracy and Islam are incompatible. Now, most of Scheffer's data, including this specific percentage, was based upon research conducted by Professor Ruud Koopmans. I managed to find a relevant paper and propose we go through the data together.
Within the very first minute of her video, she has already made an error. How so? Because the claim that 50% of Dutch Muslims believe that Islam and democracy are incompatible does not exist in a supposedly relevant paper she references. The specific study in question, authored by Dutch sociologist Ruud Koopmans, titled Religious Fundamentalism and Outgroup Hostility Among Muslims and Christians in Western Europe, nowhere mentions the word incompatible, nor the phrase not compatible. And where it does mention the word democracy, it refers to a statement within a previous study about German Muslims who believe that following the prescriptions of my religion is more important than democracy. So not only is the claim in question absent from the study altogether, but the closest thing to it doesn't even refer to Dutch Muslims, nor the incompatibility of their religious sentiments with democracy. And I can say with a great deal of confidence that the words more important and incompatible are not synonymous, no matter how hard one tries to play with semantics. For example, imagine if someone said, my family is more important than democracy. To then conclude that said person's family is incompatible with democracy would be ludicrous.
As Scheffer said, a disturbingly large minority seems to believe that religious laws are more important than the judicial system of the Netherlands. Now, when he said that, what he meant, to be more specific, is that 43% of Dutch Muslims seem to believe that religious laws are more important than the secular laws of the state. Now, 43% is indeed a disturbingly large minority, and if I can be more specific, that is a minority that is 8 digits away from being a small majority.
Once again, this quote is in reference to previous research and is not actually part of the study itself. However, what Gryffix appears to be implying is that because Muslims believe their religious obligations, such as praying 5 times a day, dressing modestly, eating halal food, fasting for the month of Ramadan, etc., are more important than Dutch laws, that this means that they are prone to criminal behavior. However, this is a non sequitur. And what is a non sequitur? Well, our trusty logic lamp can help us answer that. A non sequitur is a fallacy of logic which literally translates to does not follow. It occurs when the premises of an argument do not form a necessary connection to the conclusion. To make this more clear, an analogy can be made with Westerners who live and work in Muslim-majority countries, such as Malaysia and the UAE. Now, I'm 100% certain that most expats value the laws of their home countries far more than those countries they work and reside in. However, it would be absurd for me to conclude, by virtue of this sentiment alone, that they are therefore more prone to committing criminal offenses. To be fair though, Gryffix may point out the fact that Muslim immigrants, particularly from Morocco, are far more prone to poverty and criminal behavior than any other group in the Netherlands. However, this is irrelevant, because no credible studies consider religiosity to be a factor behind this phenomenon. And that's not surprising given that no control groups have yet to be set up to compare Muslim immigrant behavior on a global scale. For instance, if we were to compare the situation in the Netherlands with that of the United States, we would find very different results. Muslim immigrants in the US tend to do as well as the majority, sometimes even better, despite being less than 1% of the population. And unlike the Netherlands, it has no forceful policies requiring immigrants to quote-unquote integrate. In other words, a credible researcher would be less likely to blame religion for this problem, and more likely to find fault with Dutch society itself.
Now, the same study also provided us with this graph, which I used in one of my most recent videos on Islam, and which you are probably familiar with if you are subscribed to Dr. Lehman. What this graph says is that roughly 60% of foreign-born and native-born immigrant generations think Muslims should return to the roots of Islam. 75% think only one interpretation of the Quran is possible. Now, let's do away with this graph and look at another one. This one, for instance. This graph doesn't show us the level of fundamentalism amongst Christians and Muslims, but instead shows us the outgroup hostility. And what they mean by that is, for instance, how members of these groups think about, for instance, gay people or Jews. If we take the first and second generation of immigrants together, like I did in the last graph, we are looking at 57% of Muslims who would reject homosexual friends. 45% do not trust Jews, and 54% see the West as this enemy that is just out to destroy Islam.
Here, Gryffix shows some data on certain beliefs and attitudes of first and second generation Muslim immigrants in the Netherlands. Apparently, these results are problematic. Never mind the fact that recent studies have shown much more outgroup hostility among native Dutch than Muslim immigrants.
Now, as someone who has worked as a teacher, I know flooding you with data will probably be counterproductive, so I will leave it at that.
Let me get this straight. Showing 3 excerpts from one academic paper is flooding people with information? Talk about insulting the intelligence of your audience.
You know, pause the video if you have to, and please absorb this information. Try to comprehend what these statistics are telling you. We have a problem, okay? And when I say we, I don't just mean the Dutch. I mean all of us, Europeans and to an extent Americans as well.
So apparently there's a problem with having fundamentalist views. Unfortunately, Gryffix doesn't actually tell us what that problem is in this video. All she offers as evidence are some anecdotes about how some people were murdered in the Netherlands or had to leave.
Now, I think the Netherlands, in case that wasn't clear yet, and its Islamic population have a lot of problems that need to be solved. And these problems can't be solved unless we start discussing them fairly. As long as we lie about the cause of fundamentalism or the severity of the issue that it poses us with, we will continue to be part of the problem. And for everyone who has ever doubted that, allow me to remind you of Dutch politician Pim Fortuyn, or also a Dutchman, Ayaan Hirsi Ali's friend and filmmaker Theo van Gogh. Regardless of what you think of these two gentlemen, they were killed, slaughtered, because they spoke their minds about the topic of Islam. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali, well, thank God nothing happened to her, but she had to leave the country several years ago because she felt like she wasn't safe here anymore.
I'm a bit confused about the examples she offers regarding the supposed consequences of Muslim fundamentalism. For instance, Pim Fortuyn was not killed by a Muslim extremist. let alone a Muslim to begin with. He was assassinated by a non-Muslim Dutch national by the name of Volker van der Graaf, who murdered him because he thought he was going to be the next Hitler. Yes, this was prompted by Fortune's anti-Muslim sentiments, but his death had no connection whatsoever to religious fundamentalism. Another example brought up was Asadullah Ali, who did not leave the Netherlands because she felt scared of Muslim fundamentalists. She left because the government found out she had lied on her asylum applications, and she feared they'd force her out of the country. She never wanted to leave the Netherlands to begin with, but she felt coerced to do so by virtue of something completely unrelated to Muslim extremism. She even states this herself on her biography page at her current place of work. As for Theo van Gogh, well, we'll touch up more on that at a later point. For now, let's continue.
I'd also like to remind you that there is no such thing as Buddhismophobia or Hinduophobia. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is no coincidence. The fact that Islam isn't exactly popular to begin with has something to do with the experiences people have with Islam. And surely anti-Muslim bigotry can widen the gap between Muslims and non-Muslims even further. I'm not excusing actual discrimination against Muslims. I mean, I'm a liberal, I oppose any form of discrimination. But it cannot hurt to ask ourselves the question why there is bigotry towards Muslims and not against, say, Chinese people. As Paul Scheffer put it, when the Muslim community asks us to be tolerant of Islam, I answer yes. But then I will ask them if they are tolerant of Dutch society. Are they willing to accept the equality between men and women? Are they willing to accept our homosexuals?
What I don't think Gryffix realizes is that the answer to her question regarding why there is more bigotry against Muslims as opposed to other groups is in the very statement she quotes from Paul Scheffer, and not in the way she probably thinks. You see, tolerance is about coexisting with others while being able to disagree with them. It's not about acceptance. However, Gryffix appears to be implying that unless you agree that sodomy is morally virtuous, and actively go out of your way to be BFFs with homosexuals, drinking alcohol and eating pork sandwiches with them, then you're not being tolerant. I could be wrong here, so I'm open to correction, but it does appear that the whole Dutch policy of integration is far more concerned with forced conversion than tolerance. Now, as a fundamentalist Muslim myself, who in many respects only subscribes to one interpretation of my religion, I don't agree with this version of tolerance. In fact, I think it's very possible to respect and act justly with people I disagree with, without ever feeling the need to impose my values onto them. This belief of mine is exemplified in the Quran itself. However, according to Gryffix, apparently there is a problem with me having only one interpretation of my religion, and that I should quote-unquote reform myself by considering additional interpretations that are far more quote-unquote enlightened. Well, pardon me for feeling hesitant at such a suggestion. And for those of you shouting at the screen that these verses have been abrogated because the supposedly more violent verses revealed in Medina cancel out the more peaceful ones revealed in Mecca, I'm afraid that doesn't work on me. Not only is that a completely unsubstantiated exegetical approach, but even if it were correct, it would not apply in this instance. Why? Because these verses were revealed in Medina, not Mecca. Now, after watching this video, I came to the conclusion that Gryffix is attempting to argue the following. Fundamentalist beliefs lead Muslims to justify and support the violent imposition of Islam onto others, and in many cases, even leads them directly to violence. However, so as not to strawman my opposition, I searched for another relevant video by Gryffix in order to confirm this interpretation. Lo and behold, I came across her video titled Regressive: Radicalization Doesn't Exist, where she argues against a reporter from Al Jazeera regarding the existence and nature of radicalization. Therein, she states the following.
We will only call a Muslim radical when he or she is a religious fanatic that holds a very literal interpretation of Islamic scripture and has views that make it very hard for him or her to ever coexist with Westerners in a Western country. And there are huge problems with young Muslim men who radicalize and at some point even leave the country to go join ISIS. And don't even come with geopolitical and social-economic circumstances. Yes, those do play a part in the problems that we are having in the Middle East, but I am talking about Muslims who were born and raised in Western countries and who often come from a good family. Their families are westernized, they speak the language, they are very laid back and liberal with their religion, and are sometimes even studying in universities. And all of a sudden, it just goes wrong. This happened to a kid from my town. He was probably the most liberal Muslim I've ever met, but during the summer break he locked himself up in his room watching God knows what videos, and then he joined ISIS. He even made a video in Iraq announcing his suicide, after which he blew himself up in Baghdad near a police station, killing dozens of people. This guy was so incredibly nice, but something turned him into a monster, and that something is called religion. But look, I agree with you, not all Muslims are like that. Not all Muslims radicalize and go out to kill the infidels, gays, and disobeying women. However, that doesn't mean they are completely off the hook. Because although practicing jihadists form a minority, the groups that silently condone these practices are much, much bigger and form a majority in pretty much every Muslim country.
So this seems like confirmation enough. Given everything that Gryffix has stated thus far, I think we can safely render her theory of radicalization as follows. Step 1. First, you need a vacuum. Step 2. Take a normal liberal person and put them inside the vacuum. Step 3, add some religion. Step 4, Step 4 is, I guess the religion forces itself onto the person's mind, or I don't know. I guess we'll just call this step magic. And finally, voila, evil terrorist who wants to kill infidels. And no, I wasn't trying to make her position look absurd, because this is precisely what it is. However, to be fair, we should examine the evidences she utilizes in support of it. So first, let's look at what she thinks about radicalization.
And there's no set criteria for what the process of radicalization even looks like.
Except for the fact that there are. Just because you didn't do the research to find this out doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Or what a radical actually is.
There are criteria for that. Once again, you not doing the research doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
And continuing to talk about radicalization without any set criteria.
We do have set criteria, you just didn't do your research.
Here, Gryffix makes yet another error. You see, the graph she uses is from an unclassified 2006 FBI study titled The Radicalization Process from Conversion to Jihad, which presents a linear pathway from religiosity to violence. This same report was echoed over a year later in a 2007 FBI law enforcement bulletin. However, there is a major problem with this study. Why? Because the FBI has since rejected this model. You see, in their 2014 law enforcement bulletin, in an article titled The New Approach to Countering Violent Extremism, the FBI now claims to hold an entirely different position. Behavioral experts hypothesize that violent extremism possesses similarities to other modes of social behavior and developmental models. Most notably, violent extremism is not a linear progression, but an evolving dynamic situation involving numerous factors, catalysts, inhibitors, and mobilization variables. And you know what's most interesting about the FBI's new understanding of the radicalization process? Nowhere is the word religion proclaimed as the all-encompassing answer to the problem. In other words, had Gryffix taken just a couple of minutes to verify her sources, rather than waste time accusing others of not researching, she would have not made this blunder. Perhaps in the future, she should follow her own advice.
The fact that you find something on the internet does not mean that you can hold that thing up and yell that this is representative for the rest of society. That's a very important thing that you need to keep in the back of your head before you take things like this and use them to support your claims.
But maybe I'm being a little too harsh. I guess I just expect a lot from people who come off as thinking themselves autodidact polymaths simply by virtue of lacking a belief in God and having an internet connection. But that's besides the point, because Gryffix doesn't even find this discrepancy problematic. As she says herself, precise definitions and criteria really don't matter.
And even if there weren't any set criteria, what would your point be? That just because of a gap in the definition of the word radical, the phenomenon isn't real, so therefore we should just ignore it?
Well, actually that may be entirely reasonable, because definitions do matter. You see, if I claim that something called a gobbledygook existed, and then you asked me to give you a definition or a set criteria for determining what that was, and I responded to you, I don't know, then the first thing that would come to your mind is, well, then how can I know it exists? And while such a thing could possibly exist despite not having a set definition or criteria, to claim that it most certainly does exist would be a textbook example of incoherence. And what I find most surprising about Gryffix's nonchalant attitude about the definition of radicalization is that she often criticizes social justice warriors, particularly feminists, for their imprecise use of language to demonize their opposition.
Well, with that, I think a lot of students are scared of calling them out as well because they don't want to be labeled terms like racist or sexist. And I think that has a massive sway in the minds of a lot of students who don't necessarily like what's going on at the moment.
The word racist or sexist is basically like pushing a big red button and you completely detonate the conversation. And this is such a powerful weapon because you can completely derail a discussion. The moment you if I would be a social justice warrior and we would be debating and you say something that I can't debunk, or you give me an argument that I can't say anything against, all I have to do is say, you're just doing this because you're a sexist, and then I win. It's too easy and it works, and I hope that the effect will wear off in the future.
In other words, Gryffix is okay with requiring set criteria for a concept when she means to utilize it as a point of contention, but when it comes to her own use of definitions, convenience becomes the standard. And this is really only the beginning of the problem, because not only is it ludicrous to constantly talk about something you can't define, but it's especially dangerous when you want to create government policies on the basis of it. For instance, the British counter-terrorism strategy known as PREVENT has come under attack recently for not only lacking standard procedures of peer review, but also because of its highly dubious methodology and erroneous conclusions. I mean, if your entire analysis of a problem is based on vague interviews with 20 convicts, yes, 20 convicts, it's difficult to reasonably justify why this should be applied to the broader population, especially when some of the victims of this policy have been children as young as 4 years old, interrogated and harassed for their innocuous statements and behaviors. So for Gryffix to basically assert that it's not a problem that we don't have set criteria for what constitutes as radicalization is not only irrational, but it's morally irresponsible. Other evidences she uses also run contrary to her theory. For instance, she presents the following statistics.
What I have right here is one of the many trustworthy polls that you can find on the internet regarding this topic. Now, this Pew poll shows us the support for Sharia law per Muslim country.
This graph is from a Pew poll study from 2013 called The World's Muslims, Religion, Politics, and Society. Gryffix uses this data to suggest that support for Sharia automatically makes Muslims extremists supportive of or directly affiliated with groups like ISIS. But once again, there is no evidence for this, and in fact the evidence points to the contrary. For one, Gryffix fails to mention that within the very same study she uses, it shows that the majority of Muslims believe that Sharia should only apply to Muslims. And among those that support Sharia being applied to everyone, there is no data on whether or not this should be done by force or by vote. However, Chapter 2 of this same study gives us some clues. You see, the majority of Muslims also happen to believe that religious freedom for non-Muslims is a good thing. And in another Pew study, that same majority has negative opinions of groups like ISIS. Gryffix then goes on to cite yet another Pew study in support of her theory.
Are suicide bombings justifiable? Next statistic, also a Pew poll. Note the second section, against Americans and Westerners in Iraq. Look at that. Why not? Why not just bomb them? Why not just blow yourself up?
Again, Gryffix is being disingenuous. Firstly, she is using an entirely different Pew study to show Muslim sentiments towards suicide bombing, despite the fact that the previous poll she used already showcases that the majority of Muslims are opposed to it. Secondly, the poll she references here is from a 2004 Pew study titled A Year After Iraq War. In other words, the reasons for the favorable opinions towards suicide bombings in Iraq is a direct response to the illegal and unjust war against the Iraqi population by the United States and its allies. In other words, the targets of these suicide bombings are not just some random American tourist who just happened to be vacationing in Iraq, as Gryffix would have you believe, but people actively engaged in invading and killing innocent Iraqis. In other words, what Gryffix has done here is nothing less than morally repugnant. Now, I'm not one to support suicide bombings because I believe Islam opposes acts of suicide. However, I cannot conceive of any valid moral sentiment that thinks it's wrong for people to defend themselves against an unjust occupying military force, which to this day has led to the deaths of at least 250,000 people, not to mention the rise of ISIS. And maybe that number doesn't sound so big to people like Gryffix because it didn't happen in France, but I assure you, this tragedy is far too great to compensate with Facebook profile filters.
This lady are statistics, and statistics are not bigoted. Statistics are not racist. Statistics are not politically or emotionally motivated, because facts don't care about your feelings. This is simply the data that is available to us, and I hope I'm not the only one who finds this incredibly concerning. So no, not all Muslims are extremists, and certainly not in Western countries. But way too many are, especially in predominantly Islamic countries. So no, not all Muslims are extremists, but still way too many are. Even within Western countries, the numbers are scary.
Yes, statistics aren't bigoted, but people like Gryffix can be bigoted, especially when they claim that the majority of Muslims are extremists that support groups like ISIS. And so far, Gryffix's analysis on the evidence has been littered with errors, not to mention baseless implications. I mean, if we were to visualize what the data is saying versus what Gryffix thinks the data is saying, it might look something like this. What the data says, what Gryffix thinks the data says. What the data says, what Gryffix thinks the data says. What the data says, what Gryffix thinks the data says. But it gets worse, especially when we examine the most contemporary research on the subject of radicalization. You see, there are actual reasons why the Al Jazeera reporter claimed it doesn't exist. And those same reasons are what prompted the FBI to change their views as well. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome back to iJihad. In the last episode, we confronted a popular Dutch YouTuber by the name of Gryffix regarding her belief that Islamic fundamentalism supports, justifies, and in many cases directly leads to the violent imposition of Islamic values onto others, otherwise known as radicalization. Her views have also been vigorously supported by a popular German YouTuber by the name of Kraut NT, who has sponsored some of her videos on his own channel. That said, prior to watching this episode, it would be wise for my viewers to watch the previous episode, which can be found in the iJihad playlist. However, if you've already done so, here's a quick summary of what's transpired so far. Firstly, we found that Gryffix had misused an academic study, fabricating his claims to support her own conclusion, despite the author explicitly stating that his work should not be used for this purpose. Secondly, we found that Gryffix was utilizing an FBI report from 2006 as evidence of there being a set criteria for what constitutes as radicalization, despite the fact that the FBI has since rejected their own research since 2014. And finally, we found Gryffix selectively quoting statistics, despite those same studies providing additional data that ran contrary to her conclusions. And these were just some of the problems. Other minor discrepancies were also found throughout her work. In addition to this, shortly after the first episode, our detractors responded in a rather interesting fashion. The first one stated that she had no time to address the criticism being put forth, and even laughed about being challenged. I suppose this means she won't be retracting her erroneous views anytime soon. As for the other one, he responded by proclaiming that he would address my objections, without actually attempting to understand what those objections were. He then later had a change of heart and banned me for apparently being unworthy of his attention.
I also made one very important decision, which is to never, ever, under any circumstances, ban people from whatever platform I have merely because I disagree with them.
Needless to say, their initial reactions do not provide any reassurance of intellectual integrity. Despite this, however, let us proceed to examine current research on the subject of Islamic fundamentalism and radicalization. This will allow for the elucidation of a proper understanding of the subject while revealing an inconvenient truth that many people are going to have to face before solving this problem. So let's begin. Starting with a study conducted in 2015 titled A Decade Lost, Rethinking Radicalization and Extremism, authored by Professor Arun Kudnani, it was found that much of the popular sentiment on radicalization and terrorism has little to no empirical evidence. And I quote, In the official narrative, the political context and the internal decision-making within an insurgent social movement are largely irrelevant in explaining why terrorist violence occurs. Instead, the official narrative implies that once an individual has adopted an extremist religious ideology, terrorism will result, irrespective of the political context or any calculation on the part of an organization or social movement. In conclusion, the factors which lead someone to commit acts of terrorism are complex and cannot be reduced to holding a set of values deemed to be radical. There is little evidence to support the view that there is a single cause to terrorism. I encourage everyone to read that study in full. However, if you're one of those people who's just looking at Arun Kundnani's name and thinks, well, he sounds foreign, so he must be a biased Muslim, then I'm afraid you're mistaken. Professor Kundnani is an ex-Hindu turned atheist. That said, even if he were a Muslim, it wouldn't really matter. To declare someone's arguments or research invalid because they appear to be biased is a fallacious form of reasoning. In philosophy, we call this a vested interest fallacy. And why is this a problem? Because if bias was all that was needed to prove an argument wrong, then literally not a single person that has ever existed would have a valid thought in their head. But I digress. This sentiment is also mentioned in the previously referenced 2014 FBI report from the last episode. Adding to the conclusion is yet another prominent researcher on terrorism, Mark Sageman, a former CIA operative, a forensic psychiatrist, and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Sageman used to promote the theory that religious ideology leads to violence, but he has since recanted this view, stating, "The notion that there is any serious process called radicalization or indoctrination is really a mistake. Government should stop being brainwashed by this notion of radicalization. There is no such thing." Another study called Radicalization Processes Leading to Acts of Terrorism, published in 2008 by the European Commission's Expert Group on Violent Radicalization, states the following: "Clearly, the espousal of a particular ideology does not guarantee that a radicalization process will ensue. Many other elements and their interplay must be present for the individual to progress through the personal and social transit that radicalization into violence entails. Moreover, individuals in need of an ideological framework very often develop an instrumentalized, cut-and-paste interpretation of a given ideology in order to justify their recourse to violence." Another researcher, John Horgan, director at the International Center for the Study of Terrorism at Pennsylvania State University, supports this conclusion when he states that the idea that radicalization causes terrorism is perhaps the greatest myth alive today in terrorism research. First, the overwhelming majority of people who hold radical beliefs do not engage in violence. And second, there is increasing evidence that people who engage in terrorism don't necessarily hold radical beliefs. Moving on, a study called What's So Religious About Religious Terrorism, published in 2011, showcases that there are little to no differences between secular terrorism and religious terrorism, both operationally and in terms of goals. Professor Oliver Roy also contributes to contemporary findings on this matter. For example, when writing about French Muslims, he claims that members of the second generation do not adhere to the Islam of their parents, nor do they represent a tradition that is rebelling against Westernization. They are Westernized. They speak better French than their parents. They have all shared in the youth culture of their generation. They've drunk alcohol, smoked weed, flirted with girls in nightclubs. The fanatical individualism of these youth goes back to their isolation from Muslim communities. Few among them regularly attend a mosque. The religious leaders they eventually choose to follow are often self-proclaimed imams. The radicalization arises around the fantasy of heroism, violence, and death, not of Sharia or utopia. Another study called Salafi Violence and Sufi Tolerance shows that theological orientation plays absolutely zero role in determining whether a group or individual participates in terrorism, showcasing that religion plays little to no motivating role in extremist behaviors. The sociologist Scott Atran, who testified to the US Senate in March 2010, adds to this by saying that those who join terrorist organizations tend to be disenfranchised youth who basically choose a religious identity only to make coherent the things they already believe in and want to do. Further supplement comes from Arizona State University in a study published in 2012 called How Islamist Extremists Quote the Quran, which analyzed how extremists use religious texts. The researchers found the following: "We conclude that verses extremists cite from the Quran do not suggest an aggressive offensive foe seeking domination and conquest of unbelievers, as is commonly assumed. Instead, they deal with themes of victimization, dishonor, and retribution." A case in point is the late Osama bin Laden, a lionized figure not only for Al-Qaeda, but ISIS as well. For example, in one of many interviews, he justified the killing of civilians in the following manner. They say that the killing of innocents is wrong and invalid, and for proof, they say that the Prophet ﷺ forbade the killing of children and women. And that is true. It is valid and has been laid down by the Prophet ﷺ in an authentic tradition. But this forbidding of killing children and innocents is not set in stone. We treat others like they treat us. Those who kill our women and our innocent, we kill their women and innocent, until they stop doing so. That said, something should be immediately apparent here. Despite his religious veneer, bin Laden was not a fundamentalist. It is clear that he does not believe in just one interpretation of Islamic teachings, even to the point of overriding direct commands from the Prophet Muhammad himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. However, what Gryffix wants us to believe is that fundamentalists like me, who do believe that the prohibition of killing non-combatants is set in stone, are somehow the problem. Moving on, we come to yet another interesting study published in 2014 by the Combating Terrorism Center of the US military, called the Caliphate's Global Workforce, which analyzed the professions and education of ISIS militants. After analyzing a number of ISIS documents, the study found that those with more education in Islam were less likely to conduct acts of suicide bombing. As a result of this data, the study concluded that if martyrdom is seen as the highest religious calling, then a reasonable expectation would be that the people with the most knowledge about Islamic law, i.e. Sharia, would desire to carry out these operations with greater frequency. In other words, despite the religious justification that the organization uses for these actions, those with the most religious knowledge within the organization itself are the least likely to volunteer to be suicide bombers. And a report on radicalization from MI5 echoes this point. And for those suggesting that suicide bombing is primarily performed for the sake of martyrdom, which results in the forgiveness of sins, there is absolutely zero data which shows this to be the prime motivation behind individuals performing these acts. Not only that, but such a conclusion runs contrary to the idea that religiosity is the problem. How so? Because the implication infers that those with more religious knowledge should be more pious, and seeing as the more knowledgeable refuse to conduct suicide bombings, this thus infers that more religion, not less, is a preventative measure. But what about the education of extremists? Hasn't it been proven that many terrorists are actually quite educated? Certainly. However, the more that we examine exactly what sort of education most terrorists receive prior to their extremism, the more we find their motivations contrary to religious conviction. For example, a recent study published in 2016 called Engineers of Jihad found that those from the STEM fields, mostly engineering, are more likely to join violent terrorist groups. With the proper controls in place, the study found that engineers are overrepresented in terrorist organizations not due to their expertise in the operations of said groups, aka making weapons and bombs. Rather, they are overrepresented for reasons specifically related to their educational and psychological backgrounds. In other words, because of their absolutist machine-like interpretations of the world, they are more prone to joining groups with simplistic and machine-like solutions to problems. Given that violence is the easiest and quickest means towards change, it is not surprising that they are attracted to terrorist groups. It is also not surprising why engineers often rank the lowest in religiosity among other extremists. In this respect, the late philosopher Friedrich Hayek predicted this would be the case. At this point, I gather that the responses from people like Gryffix will be to put on their tinfoil hats and start shouting about how all of the aforementioned research is just the product of a regressive liberal conspiracy to protect Islam from criticism. But this notion is pathologically absurd. I mean, even without all of these studies, if you just examine Gryffix and Crout and T's logic, you cannot possibly think their position rational. According to both of them, a Muslim who has lived most of their life following secular liberal values, who doesn't pray or attend mosque, who drinks, does drugs, fornicates, actively engages in criminal activity, has little to no knowledge about Islam, only then to suddenly put on a veneer of religiosity so as to justify their violent behavior, this person is considered a representative of devout Islamic fundamentalism. For example, the murderer of Theo van Gogh, Mohammed Bouyeri. Whereas, on the other hand, Muslims who do pray in frequent mosque, don't drink, don't do drugs, don't fornicate, don't engage in criminal activity, are knowledgeable about their religion, and don't engage in violent behavior, you know, people who actually follow the fundamentals of Islam, these people are considered religiously lax moderates who don't take their beliefs seriously. Right. And I suppose that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a shining exemplar of liberal democracy in action. I mean, if we were to visualize what the evidence shows on this matter versus what Gryffix and Crout and T think the evidence shows, it might look something like this. What the evidence shows, what Gryffix and Crout and T think the evidence shows. What the evidence shows, what Gryffix and Crout and T think the evidence shows. What the evidence shows, what Gryffix and Crout and T think the evidence shows. Which brings me to my next point. What is actually motivating Muslims towards violence and the desire to impose their values onto others? Well, I can safely say that if we really want to discuss whose values are in conformity with indiscriminate violence and the imposition of one's way of life onto others, the evidence does not bode well for Western culture. For instance, let's look at some more statistics and studies, starting with a Gallup poll released in 2011 called "Most Muslim Americans See No Justification for Violence." Here, you find the percentage of American Muslims who believe that military attacks on civilians is never justified, as well as the percentage of Muslims who think that it is sometimes justified. Now, I find it abhorrent that 21% of Muslims in America think that it is sometimes justified to attack civilians. However, what I find even more abhorrent is the fact that non-religious, atheists, and agnostics are more than twice as likely to think the same thing. I mean, look at that. 43% of people without a religious affiliation think it's sometimes justified to kill civilians in war. And I'm pretty sure that these people aren't Islamic fundamentalists to any degree. And I can already foresee the objections to this poll loudly pronounced from the rooftops, that meaningless platitude that never seems to die. Well, you don't see atheists attaching bombs to themselves and blowing themselves up in a crowded market. Yes, of course you don't see atheists, Christians, and Jews doing indiscriminate suicide bombings, but it's not because of superior moral virtue. Rather, it's because they don't have to. You see, the only difference between Muslim extremists and many secular liberals is that while the former deliver their bombs personally, the latter has the convenience of a conventional military to deliver bombs on their behalf. That convenience is most evident in the fact that so many Westerners, in their morbid curiosity, take pleasure in watching those bombs dropped on innocent people live from the comfort of their own homes like it were some sporting event.
Good. All right, listen to this, Jamie. These are shots being fired now in Baghdad. I want our viewers to listen in. So there you see it. You just saw it. You just heard it. Approximately 5 to 8 minutes of an intense airstrike against targets in Baghdad. Remember, this is a city of 5 million people. We can only imagine what terrifying state most of those people are presumably in right now as they see this huge round of airstrikes going after selected targets.
And later, they even celebrate the violence in a major motion picture. But this is America, not the rest of the Western world, you may say. And you're right, despite the United States controlling global politics and economy, we cannot generalize all secular liberal countries on the basis of one example. Which is why I refer everyone to examine yet another Gallup poll released in 2011 called Views of Violence. This study is global and analyzes 131 countries regarding their views on intentionally targeting civilians in military conflict. In other words, this is not about collateral damage. The results of this study not only confirm previous research in regards to the erroneous connection between religion and violence, but also the previous Gallup poll. In summary, non-Muslim Westerners are more likely to justify the intentional killing of civilians than Muslims globally. Once again, non-Muslim Westerners are more likely to justify the intentional killing of civilians than Muslims around the world. Also worth noting is the fact that those Muslims who do advocate for killing non-combatants tend to take their religion less seriously. Also, Muslims who justify targeting civilians, especially those residing in Western countries, tend to be isolated from their communities. To get a clearer picture of the data, let's make some comparisons between some well-known Western nations and their allies. Starting with where Crouten T is from, Germany is more likely than 5 Muslim-majority countries to justify the direct targeting of civilians. Following this, France is outclassed by 11 Muslim-majority nations and tied with 3. Then you have the Netherlands, where Gryffix resides, which is outclassed by 20 Muslim-majority nations. This is followed by the United Kingdom, which is outclassed by 21 Muslim-majority nations. And finally, Israel and the United States, which are outclassed by a total of 22 Muslim-majority nations. But it shouldn't be surprising that most Western non-Muslims see very little problem with this sort of violence. Firstly, Western governments tend to define terrorism in such a way that they make themselves immune from ever being accused of it. And secondly, history and contemporary events have shown a strong distinction between how Islamic civilization has typically treated its enemies versus Western liberal civilization. You see, Muslims have normatively behaved like this.
Okay, you win. Indeed, Durga. So now what? Pay a small tax and don't own weapons. And in exchange, you are granted maximum autonomy to govern as you wish under our protection. Really, that's it. And you have to call me awesome. You're awesome. I know.
Whereas secular liberals have normatively behaved like this.
Surrender your land, your resources, your women, your culture, your religion, your values, your language, and everything else you hold dear, and become exactly like us. For liberty! Sir, wouldn't it just be easier to kill most of them and enslave the rest? Most indeededly. And then our awesome descendants can make holidays celebrating our genocide.
And put genocidal racist maniacs who purposely starved millions of Bengalis and advocated chemical warfare on your currency. That works too, I guess. And this is why I find it very surprising when people call for Islam to be reformed in accordance with the moral standards of Western civilization. But what would I know? I'm apparently not as civilized as those who abide by secular liberal values, constantly berating others around me as savages and reminding them of the inferiority of their own lives. And I don't support the killing of innocent people for the sake of some self-proclaimed enlightened civilization. No, I'm just an Islamic fundamentalist.